Okay. Welcome everyone to the last plenary for the day. My name is Fitzner. I'm the Chief Economist at the Office for National Statistics and Environment, Environmental Accounts, Natural Capital, etc. One of the areas I'm responsible for at the ONS. In a moment I'll be handing over to our three speakers to take you through really quite an overview of both what's happening in the UK, what's happening internationally, with some quite interesting, I think, food for thought. So I'm sure that will elicit lots of questions. Now, the theme for this afternoon is measuring progress towards an environmentally sustainable economy. That, of course, begs lots of questions. What is an environmentally sustainable economy? And picking up on a point that I think one of the consistent themes through this conference is how do we make sure that our statistics, our data, our measurement and our analysis is keeping up with a rapid pace of change across many areas of the economy, digital, environmental, etc. And this is certainly an area where I think at the ONS we're facing ever-growing demands, requests for more. Green finance, green jobs, green everything, pretty much. Now, of course, some of the work that we do in the ONS you may be familiar with, the work we've been doing on green jobs, for example, the low carbon and renewable energy survey, which we publish every year, and certainly our natural capital accounts. But one of the things that we are going to be working with ESCO on in the next year or two is mapping what we call whole economy transition, what other people, I guess, would call green transition, which is if we want to get to where we need to get to achieve net zero, what's going to have to change and how will we be able to gauge progress and really measure what's going on in the economy in a way that plugs some of the quite large data gaps that we have at the moment. So some of that is conceptual, some of that is kind of quite practical measurement issues, and that may involve new surveys, it may involve repurposing the ELCRE survey, almost certainly it will involve greening our existing business data collections to build in some of those elements that are missing at the moment. So look out for that, but that work is kicking off and I think will probably lead to us doing more in this space. And indeed, of course, we're working very closely with the UN, the IMF and others on a range of international initiatives to do more in this area as well, including yet another IMF acronym that at some point in the next few years you'll hear about, DGI 3, which stands for Data Gap Initiative 3. The IMF is really good with catchy phrases and acronyms. Again, which I'm leading at the ONS and helping coordinate across government. So that will, about half of the new measures that the IMF are asking countries to produce are related to the environment, environmental accounts. So again, I expect that you'll see more happening in that space before too long. Now, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Matthew Agarwala, and then we'll have Anne and Laura followed by questions. So as they speak, if a question comes to mind, just hold on to that until we get to the Q&A. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. So my name is Matthew. I'm an economist at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and at the Tobin Centre for Economic Policy at Yale University. I've been working in Beyond GDP for 10 to 13 years now, and so we would have thought perhaps we'd have gotten beyond it. And there's a question as to whether or not we're actually going somewhere or whether this is just a catchy slogan that's going to keep us employed for another few years. And so what I'm hoping to do is share some ideas that might get us beyond the slogan and hopefully towards actually delivering something different for the economy. If we want to go beyond GDP, first of all, we have to understand what GDP is and all of its shortcomings. I take that as read largely for this audience. If you haven't read it, then Diane Coyle's book, GDP, A Brief But Affectionate History, is the place to start. And I'm not just saying that because she's my boss. There are at least two things that I think we ought to do differently in economic statistics and measurement. And one is, they both are around changing perspectives. And one of the perspectives that I think we ought to change, or at least add, is to stop looking backwards always and start thinking about forward-looking measurements. And GDP, even at its best, will only ever tell us what happened last quarter or last year. And what we are really trying to do is build forward towards a more sustainable economy in the future. And the challenges and obstacles that we face, the risks that we face, are all forwards looking. And so our economic statistics that are always backwards looking are going to give us limited insight into the future when we think about the scale and the magnitude of the change that climate change and biodiversity loss are going to bring for us, and the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable, low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. So we have to stop looking just backwards and start looking forwards in our statistics. We can do this in our risk measurements, and I think we can do this in our wealth accounting as well. The difference here is like getting a diagnosis beforehand from your doctor versus waiting for the autopsy report afterwards. And GDP is basically the economic autopsy report. Now, I think that the way to get beyond the autopsies is to start thinking beyond just income and start thinking about wealth. Because wealth, capital, all capital is a claim on the future. Its value today is the net present value of future flows. You may think we're better or worse at identifying what those flows are, or how we might deflate them, or how we might discount them, but at least we should be thinking into the future and forward. So the idea, the intellectual history that underpins the work that I've been doing at the Bennett comes from Partha Dasgupta and others, and it's largely now understood as the theory of inclusive wealth. And the idea is, basically imagine you're running a bakery. The size of the pie that you can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in your pantry. Run out of ingredients, and tomorrow's pie is smaller. Well, it turns out that over half a century, what people like Sir Partha and Bob Solow and David Pearce and Giles Atkinson and Ken Arrow and a number of others, James Tobin, Bill Nordhaus, have shown us is that the economy operates exactly like a bakery. The size of our economic pantry determines the size of our economic pie. Whether we call that prosperity or welfare or even GDP, it all depends on our economic assets. And those should be broadly defined. So we're talking about physical capital. Yes, we know that. That's an important story here at ESCO all the time. We're talking about human capital. Yes, at ESCO, we know that that's a major issue. And we know that in the national accounts, it's missing and it ought to be addressed more completely. There's also natural capital, which is getting a lot of airtime at recent ESCO conferences. And actually the UK's ONS, thanks Grant, is one of the leading institutions for developing natural capital accounts anywhere in the world. So GDP has focused on the size of the pie, but wealth accounting, inclusive wealth accounting, focuses on that economic pantry. And it's these capitals that constitute the core ingredients of prosperity, and we need to measure them. But if we want to shift from measuring the pie to measuring the pantry, we have a coordination problem. Statistics are useful when they are consistent within a country over time and between countries at a point in time. It doesn't help to tell you that my company did 100,000 in revenue last year. You have no idea whether that's a good year or a terrible year. It depends on whether I normally do 1 billion in revenue or 5,000, right? So the accounts are useful over time, and when we have major changes, like how we might incorporate nature into national accounts, you can have really big swings in the accounting. There are lots of competing ideas as to what ought to replace GDP. I think they're all a little bit, it's the wrong question. I really think it ought to be what should augment GDP, what should we have alongside it, and for that I think the answer is inclusive wealth. Now, we've got major initiatives on how we might start to calculate natural capital, how we might account for it, how we might measure and value it. The UN System of Environmental Economic Accounts has been accepted as an official statistical standard. The central framework was adopted by the General Assembly in 2012, and the extended ecosystem accounts were accepted in March of 2021. These are tectonic changes in the way that the world can now start to account for natural capital because we've got the guidebook. The problem is the capacity to compile these accounts is highly unequally distributed around the world, and it seems almost inversely proportional to the amount of natural capital worth accounting for. So yes, in the UK, it's brilliant that we have the most advanced, most sophisticated, most reliable, most frequent natural capital accounts in the world, or at least in the top 2 or 3. But we're doing this in what is also the most nature-depleted country in the world, or one of them. And so we ought to really focus on building the capacity to develop natural capital accounts in other parts of the world. That means investing in the statistical infrastructure as well. The international institutions that have led the charge on inclusive wealth accounting or comprehensive wealth accounting, it's the World Bank, it's the United Nations. The bank's been doing this since the 90s. The UN's been doing it since about 2010 or 2012. They've been great communication tools. They've given us a crucial proof of concept that we can start to account for physical and human and natural capital, but they are woefully inadequate. They lack the data. We're using unofficial statistics. We're making gross assumptions. The consequences of this are that countries turning to these reports for information about their inclusive wealth will find them completely lacking in credibility. The Changing Wealth of Nations 2021, the World Bank attempt at identifying the natural capital of nations, shows that about 80% of the wealth of Qatar is in oil. Well, it's not even close. It's about 10% of the wealth of Qatar is in oil. And about 85% of the natural resource wealth of Qatar is in gas. Now, that's a major issue if you're starting to think about these sorts of accounts for understanding how your country can position itself through a global energy transition, which has been especially important in recent months, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So again, we need to get beyond the international institutions, and the proper home for this kind of accounting has to be national statistics offices. Grant. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Not well, I think. So are the international institutions up for the challenge? The World Bank, the UN, the IMF, the WTO? I think not. If we want to get them to move beyond GDP, we're going to have to change the economists who are there. We're going to have to change the remits and the KPIs that they face. There's a lot of discussion. It's kind of hushed whispers at the moment about whether we need a new Bretton Woods or a Marshall Plan for nature. Well, perhaps. But remember that even with the Marshall Plan, about a third of the world lined up against it. And if that happens for nature, we're stuffed. So we have to be more successful in our investments and our management of natural capital than the Marshall Plan was in rebuilding after the Second World War. And it's not just nature. The challenges that we face from climate and biodiversity, but also through the disruption that the digital economy is going to bring, demographic changes, these are all collective action problems across countries. The idea that we can account for a modern economy with a national boundary, with any kind of relevance to the way that opportunities and risks play out in the real world, is over. So national solutions, national data that stops at the border doesn't work. We need to think about international trade in a much more sophisticated manner. We need to think about the resource management on which we depend, and not just the resource management within our borders. And our economic and political strategies need to work across that. And I think that the mandates for national statistical offices need to adjust to incorporate this. There's lots of excitement about this kind of work, from the United States developing its first natural capital strategy, to the UK's Levelling Up white paper, which based its intellectual framework, such that there was one, around inclusive wealth. And it all comes back to the work of people like Professor Partha Dasgupta. I think that's more than my time, for which I apologize.
Matthew, and if you're interested in a measure that takes account of international trade, have I got a measure for you? So what I'd like to talk to you about is consumption-based accounting and the footprint, in particular, how this is used and measured in the UK. So why measure from a consumption-based perspective? My first argument is completeness. The UK operates in a global economy. Any measure of progress towards a green economy needs to consider the impacts that are felt globally as well as those that are produced locally. The footprint or consumption-based account is a quantitative measure of the impact that a person, a business, or a place has on the planet based on their actions, usually what is consumed. It considers the impact of the supply chain of goods and services, regardless of where in the world the supply chain sits. So, taking the example of the carbon footprint, if we were to measure the carbon footprint of the UK, it adds up all of the carbon associated with consumption in the UK, including the carbon that is released in China that goes towards making goods and services that are consumed in the UK. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see an exciting Sankey chart that shows just how much we would be missing if we only considered what was going on within the territory of the UK. So on the left-hand side, you can see if you just measured the emissions associated with just the businesses and the travel and the houses within the UK, just those emissions in the territory, you're just looking at that tiny blue bit. If we go all the way over to the right-hand side, you can see that the consumption emissions, the carbon footprint, is around 40% larger if you start to include those emissions associated with imports and remove the exports, because the UK is a net importer. So where can you find these figures if you're interested in the consumption emissions for the UK? Well, look no further than the government websites. The carbon and material footprints are calculated by myself and my team at the University of Leeds and reported annually by DEFRA and the ONS. You'll notice that the previous diagram I showed you didn't have any numbers on. I'm not allowed to tell you the 2020 figures yet, but they will be released on the 7th of June, and you'll be able to find them on these websites over here. My second argument for why the consumption approach or the footprint approach is really, really useful is to do with policy. We've been talking about the UK's transition towards net zero and climate policies. These are going to be effective at cutting the imported impacts as well as those created domestically. So, for example, if you have a policy such as, low meat diets or using products for longer, this is going to not only cut emissions in the UK, it's also going to cut emissions released abroad because the UK will require less goods to meet its needs within a year. And you can only measure this if you take a consumption approach. So many of the demand side strategies, such as the sharing economy, low meat diets, can only be determined using consumption approaches because these look at the effect of the change on products. And this chart on the right-hand side shows how you can break a consumption-based footprint of a household down into many, many different goods and services that they consume. And look at this. Look at that reduction, okay? So this is a reasonably good news story that we can see in the UK. We are seeing our consumption emissions going down through a combination of decarbonisation, particularly of the electricity sector, and austerity, the credit crunch, and most recently, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how is the carbon footprint being used in UK climate policy? Well, the Committee for Climate Change has produced a report in 2022, which was called Progress in Reducing Emissions, where it states that we need to ensure that policy that's designed to reduce territorial emissions doesn't have the effect of increasing consumption emissions. So they're very, very clear that these two ways of accounting for the impacts of our economy are measured in parallel. We need to consider both the production emissions and the consumption emissions at the same time. On a more local level, London Councils, which is the organisation which is in charge of the local authorities within the Greater London Authority, have actually set a consumption-based target. They want to reduce their emissions by 2/3 from 2030, and they're using the carbon footprint to track this. The UK is really leading the way in this type of work. It's one of the few places where they're actually setting consumption-based emission target reductions. So how is it calculated? This is where it does get a little bit complicated. It's not an easy task. You cannot calculate your consumption-based account looking just in isolation. You have to understand how the global economy works. And to do this, we use environmentally extended global multi-regional input-output databases, which are essentially a large matrix, a very large matrix, which tries to understand transactions between industries and industries in different countries all over the world, and how these products reach final demand consumers. There's lots of different environmental indicators you can throw through this matrix to understand the impacts from production to a consumption perspective. I've talked about carbon. You can also look at water footprints, material extractions, etc. And all it does is it's reallocating from the point of production to the point of consumption. The diagram on the right-hand side is a heat map of a single year's table in the EORA database. And I'm hoping this gives you some idea of the scale of these databases and the amount of data that has to be collected in them. We're not just talking about what the input-output table looks like for the UK. That's just a tiny, tiny square in that, because we're obviously understanding how the UK then trades with everybody else. So where can you get hold of these multi-regional input-output databases? There are a lot of them around. I've mentioned the EORA database. I'm only including ones that you can pretty much download for free here. And again, this is one of the complexities. We're in a this is still quite a young area, and there are lots of these databases being sort of built at the same time. There's not really one that's leading the way, and obviously all of them give different results. Personally, I don't think this is a problem, because I think that each of them can be used for different purposes, each of their strengths and each of their weaknesses. So you can see that some of them are very good on sort of product resolution, some of them are very, very good on country resolution, some of them are more up to date than others, some of them have longer time series than others. And I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but it is a very exciting and new area to be in. So just to finish, I'd like to talk about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of using footprinting, consumption-based accounting to understand the greening of our economy. Well, like I said, completeness, it looks at our full impact both domestically and abroad, and it allows us to measure the effects of climate policy, particularly those from a demand-side perspective. The weaknesses, there are quite a few. I'm hoping this reduces in time, but the first one is timeliness. We've only just got the 2020 data for the UK. I'm still using a reasonable amount of assumptions to understand trade patterns in 2020, because that data's not out there yet. You need global data to produce a national calculation. And like Matthew has said before, some countries are good at producing this data and produce a lot of it. There are quite a lot of data gaps. We're lacking in data from Africa, the Middle East, and many developing nations. We have to use assumptions as to how these economies operate. It's a model. It's not as simple as measuring the fuel used in a factory and calculating the carbon emissions that are coming out of the chimney. And there are conflicting results. If you took the UK's carbon footprint from one of the models and then compared it with the other, they're not going to give you the same answer because we're looking at a model here. The reasons for this are different levels of granularity in the assumptions made in making the model. Some of these models require quite a lot of skill to get working and high performance computing to do the calculations. There's a big matrix inversion that has to happen. You know, this can take some time and it doesn't necessarily work off a slow laptop. And we aren't at the stage where there is an official, you know, this is the model to use. I'm going to talk about threats before opportunities because I'm an optimist. The threats, a lot of these data sets are produced by universities rather than statistical offices and are reliant on funding to continue. Which leads us to the opportunities. I think there is a huge opportunity for collaboration efforts between national statistical offices. The OECD is a really good example of bringing together data from OECD countries to produce the OECD inter-country input-output system. And I think that there are huge opportunities for the UK to share some of the work that it's done with other countries and also to get best practice techniques and some kind of network where we can learn from each other. We are leading the way in this type of work, and we have a lot to offer here, but also there's still a lot to do and a lot to learn. Thank you very much.
Hello, I am an environmental economist working on issues of sustainability since the 1990s, perhaps well before some of the youngest members of this audience were born. And we environmental economists are always in trepidation that some big shocks in the economy can hijack the sustainability agenda of countries and the international community. So I would like to start by thanking the organizer of this panel for keeping the dialogue on sustainability alive in this very special forum. So what I want to focus today is more of the international dimension that has been touched upon by the previous presenter. And I want to perhaps provide some insights on the progress on measuring and accounting for climate actions at domestic and international level. And in particular, I want to focus on the case studies of emerging economies. So we have very clearly understood that CO2 emissions in the UK are declining. This is not so in emerging economies. That is actually quite the contrary. So it's something we need to focus on. So this will be what I'm going to talk about. I'm reminding you of the global community target for greenhouse gas emission and warming, which is 1.5 degrees centigrade above a pro-industrial level. So we're going to see how, or perhaps more importantly, whether we can reach that, we can sustain this warming. And then I want to introduce some insight on the climate global stocktake. So this year, 2023, is the first time that countries have presented their recorded national domestic contribution. And this actually is about what climate action they're implementing and what they're going to do in the next few decades or so. as I said, I want to focus on emerging economies. I'm going to tell you very clearly why this is the case. Very briefly, they are growing very fast, but they are growing in a sustainable fashion. So the economy uses obsolete technologies and is defined as brown or dirty growth. What also want to create here, it's some sort of debate about what are the kind of policies that this country should be implement first. Would it be some market-based policies, perhaps a carbon tax? Or perhaps we need to look at the structure of the market first. So I will conclude with some insight from some dynamic stochastic general equilibrium analysis that will give us some sort of comparison about which kind of policies should be implemented for mitigation. So let me show you these diagrams. These are from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they are contained in the synthesis report of 2023, just issued. You can see on the diagram above that where the greenhouse gas emissions patterns are represented, that if we continue with the current implemented policy, we don't achieve reduction in CO2 emission, greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to cause a warming of the planet of 3.2 on average, which is unsustainable. Instead, if we were to ramp up climate policy, we can keep the 1.5 degrees alive. And you can see that the blue area represent the kind of emission reduction that we need to keep the global temperature above 1.5 above the pre-industrial level. So you see that that implies a very sharp decline in greenhouse gas emission. So the IPP report actually says that for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, so the global net greenhouse gas emission is to decline by about 45% from the 2010 level by 2030, so this is coming very fast. And if we do that, we will reach net zero by 2050. So there is an urgent need for ramping up climate action to enact this decline in CO2 emission. And therefore, measuring the impact on the economy and on emissions of this climate action is paramount. And this is why this dialogue is actually taking place. So what is the global stocktake? Well, it's not a new concept. It was already included in the documentation of the Paris Agreement in 2015, so it was Article 4.9. It's nothing else than an inventory program that legally binds countries within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to present their nationally determined contributions, in other words, to their climate plans, climate mitigation plans. And it's not including only mitigation, it's including adaptation, and it's also presenting issue in relation to climate finance, which you might know was a big issue at the last COP conferences in Glasgow, Sharm el-Sheikh, and so on. And it's only presenting the barriers and challenges for implementing this climate action at domestic level and also global level. And you see this process is iterative, it's happening every 5 years. 2023 is the first year where the climate stocktake is actually brought to the public. And sooner we will know the results of the status of climate mitigation and also the status of the warming of the Earth. So every 5 years, the next one will be 2028, this inventory, with the aim of reaching net zero in 2050. So the point is, when we look at the status of climate mitigation policies and in general climate actions, we need a very strong measurement of what each country is actually undertaking. And to do so, we need to focus on individual countries. And when we look at the developed economies, such as the United Kingdom, we have very robust modeling strategies that can give us a very good insight. But when instead we move the focus to emerging economies, then lots of problems ensued. One is the data availability, which has been covered, and other things are perhaps which modeling strategy to use. They have typically some sort of planned economy characterized by price control and heavily regulation by the government, but not using too much of market mechanism. Most of these countries actually don't have carbon taxes in place nowadays. So the focus of this kind of measurement agenda will be, yes, let's look at what carbon taxes will do for these economies, but first of all, let's focus on whether we can improve upon some pre-existing distortions that characterize lots of markets in this economy, especially the energy markets, and I'm going to focus on energy and electricity market in the next slides. So as I said, when we talk about policy, perhaps the best modeling framework is the SDG models, and those however needs to be modified to take into account all these imperfections that we see in these emerging economies. So pseudo-planned economy, price control, lack of market mechanism, and subsidies. Because prices are controlled, this is actually created a very serious issue in terms of implicit subsidy for fossil fuel. And of course, yes, when we get all this information, we can inform accurately the global stocktake and also domestic policies. Now, I already talked about the distortions that characterize this emerging economy. And another issue is that emerging economy, this is the example of Bangladesh climate pledge. So they're pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emission, but some of this reduction is conditional on help from the international community, so climate finance, in other words. As I said, this economy is growing very fast, and this is a snapshot of what is happening in Bangladesh. So this is good on one hand because it creates opportunity for, for redistributing some wealth. You can see some social indicators they are being improving in the last few years, but it's also created a problem in terms of sustainability. So what we did in one of the last papers with other co-authors, we modeled the energy market in Bangladesh, and then we plugged this modeling into a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. And we simulated different policies, the introduction of carbon tax, removing all fossil fuel subsidies, and allowing electricity to be traded at market prices. In other words, removing the price control distortion. And these are the results. And this is the controversy somehow that I wanted to bring to this forum. So when you look at the result from the simulation, you see that in the last column, so the price reform simulation is actually giving the best results in terms of GDP and all the other parameters, of course. So there will be less loss for the industrial, in terms of industrial output, increased electricity generation, and increase in consumption, and also reduction, more importantly for this forum, reduction in CO2 emission. So just removing the distortion that characterize the energy markets in this emerging economy will achieve the fulfillment of the pledge in terms of the Paris Agreement pledge in terms of reduction in CO2 emission. So that is the thing. When you look at the carbon tax scenario, you know, we simulated $5 and $30 per ton of CO2 emissions, and you see that those, since they're implemented on already distorted, heavily distorted economy, so those are not giving the same level of results that you will have just by solving the pre-existing distortion, market distortion. So this is our policy recommendation. So solve the distortion first, and then this country will probably be able to fulfill the pledge of the Paris Agreement in terms of mitigation policy. And after that, think about, if you want to achieve an even higher mitigation target, think about introducing market mechanisms such as the carbon tax. So this is the message that we want to give today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Who would like to go? Mari.
Thank you for very interesting presentations. I've got a question for Anne. Mary Spouge from Strathclyde. I totally agree with you about the need to ensure that these global resources that you mentioned that are used for these sorts of calculations are invested in, and we can ensure that they exist, so these sorts of consumption-based calculations can be done for all countries around the world. To what extent do you have concerns that the statutory targets that many countries have set, including the UK, are on the basis of territorial emissions? And so when it comes to it, the temptation to offshore emissions in order to meet those becomes too great. And do you have hope or expectation that consumption-based targets might be put on a statutory footing in future as well?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the concerns with setting a target based on your territorial emissions is that perhaps if you try and regulate UK businesses too much, they may offshore and put their high polluting factories abroad instead. There's been some work in trying to calculate the effect of this over time to see whether offshoring is a driver of reduction in production emissions and increase in consumption, and it's not as large as people fear. I can, if you want to contact me afterwards, I can point you to a paper that has looked at this. I think we're seeing the effects of reduced final demand and decarbonisation are sort of really bringing down the carbon footprint, and the production emissions are reducing through, the electricity sector essentially is really reducing at the same time. So I think consumption targets are useful. I have a few concerns as to whether we can accurately do this at the moment with the accuracy of the data. It's always improving, but it does scare me how many people are wanting to make consumption-based targets but aren't quite sure how to measure this yet.
Thank you. Gentleman on that side. Yep. Oh, it's you. Blue top.
Thank you very much. Calvin Jones from Cardiff University and Welsh Government for their sins. 3 really fascinating presentations. Thank you very much for them. I've got a question for Matthew and then for Laura. So for Matthew, we spent a lot of time in the 90s persuading people sustainable development wasn't 3 pillars of social, economic and environmental, but in fact 3 shells of the economy within society and within the natural environment. So do you think now that placing natural capital as one of 6 wealths actually is a backward step, because that actually underpins the other 5, but we're putting it back on a kind of flat playing field. And for Laura, I must admit, after spending half my life trying and largely failing to build a simple input-output table for Wales, I worry about how far DSG models can genuinely represent the reality of what goes on in places like Bangladesh, which you obviously know better than me, so that when we're looking at quite small differences in the outcomes of the policies you put there, that the micro foundations of DSG, the assumptions we have, and the data that are specifically Bangladeshi are good enough to justify nailing your colours to one of those policy masts. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I spent the 90s in grade school. I don't look it now, but it's true. So I'm not as familiar with what happened then, but the fact that we are adding natural capital into the economic production function does not prevent there being other capitals. I think that the fact that we are thinking of nature as an asset through this lens as economists does not prevent other people from thinking of it in a completely different view. There are loads of reasons to conserve nature. It might be spiritual, it might be moral or ethical, it might be selfish, I just enjoy it. It might be, we've got this thing called the rule of law, we might as well use it, let's meet our commitments under domestic and international legislation, fine. But as economists, it behaves like an asset in the economy, and so we should understand and reflect and manage that, and bring to bear what we know about the theory of the management of capital to the management of nature.
Thanks. And Laura, from your point.
So when we studied the Bangladesh economy, indeed, the first problem was to extract reliable data. When we looked at the electricity market there were so many actors to juggle with, and there are this phenomenon of quick rentals, for example. So these are firms that very quickly can generate electricity, but they rely on imported oil. So it was very difficult to attribute the share of all these key players within our model, our dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model components and so on. So that was a big challenge. And the other challenge was, since we wanted to have some figure in terms of CO2 emission from all these different players, different sectors, we needed to have a sort of conversion rate that could take into account the different fuels, could take into account the share of these key players within the entire electricity market, for example. And that was another challenge that we were focusing on. Now, it was, I would say, although it was very complicated, it was very crude because we don't have anything else than the standard investment consumption model, although, as I said, this unpacked into all these different players. If we wanted to go beyond and having another modeling framework to include the natural capital, that for Bangladesh is extremely important because it's one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of impact of climate change and so on. So if we want that, then we need a completely different framework, and all the progresses that were made in the last few years, especially in the United Kingdom and so on, so from developed countries. So it's a big endeavor, but we want to do that. We want to do that, and also in terms of redistribution. As you said, you saw from my result, the consumption is going up, but we don't have any heterogeneous individual there. We need to take into account who is gaining, who is losing out of this reform, this mitigation policy, this market reform. Because again, I think another issue is the just transition, both domestically, according to different income groups, perhaps, but also internationally, like, yes, Bangladesh is very much pushing for finances from developed countries because they're only contributing 0.47% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And so fairness is another issue that needs to be brought in, and all this advancement in measurement, I believe, your focus on consumption, focus on natural capital, will bring this more structure, more complexity into these models. We try to augment more and more this dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model to have, I would say, a more comprehensive picture of what is going on as regards climate change, natural environment, and so on.
Thank you. Question at the back. Oh, 2/3 of the way.
Yeah, hi. My question is for Matthew. As you know, I'm a real big fan of wealth accounting, and I've worked with the World Bank on I've written the scripts, I've done everything on wealth accounting. And when wealth accounting is attacked, I defend it vehemently. When wealth accounting is oversold, I tend to take the opposite position and try and give some context of overselling it. And I'd just love to hear your perspective there. So first of all, it probably sounds really alluring that the things that we learned in university as environmental economists, most of us, that actually are the theories that we learned are generalizable across environmental, social, and economic systems, and can generate kind of a theory of everything, so to speak. And this is the way to go. But I have become also interested in communication of science and statistics, and it is not the case that this is the only framework to think about sustainability in the future. So if a journalist, let's take all the technicalities out of this. If a journalist goes to Johan Rockström and asks him, is the future well-being, is it going to be great or is it not? Then he will say no. 7 planetary boundaries are being transgressed. So in my assessment from natural science, I would say there's going to be issues in the future. Now, I've worked at the World Bank on this last report. And if that same journalist goes to the World Bank, the wealth account for the world is actually increasing from 95 to 2018. And the journalist will be very confused. He will say, well, okay, from that perspective of sustainability, suddenly things are going fabulous. What exactly
Sorry,
is
we
the story?
we only have a limited amount of time available.
Sorry.
Do you have a question?
The question is, you didn't show any data for the UK. Does it have a positive story? Does it, what is your perspective on, is the future well-being great? And do you see any role for a kind of a more interdisciplinary approach? And that's perhaps also plugging the session that I'll be in tomorrow. We will also explore that tomorrow a little bit. So happy to hear your thoughts.
Everybody should go to the session tomorrow, unless it's at the same time as mine, in which case come to mine. There are some conflicting messages in the current approach to wealth accounts. Per capita wealth globally has risen, right? So wealth has risen. But so have living standards over that same 1995 to 2018 period. Life expectancy has risen, access to food has risen, access to medication has risen, literacy rates have improved. We shouldn't ignore that in our accounts either. I think there's a major challenge, though, in that environmental economists are always terrified of overestimating the value of nature. And we err so far on the side of caution that we tend to radically underestimate it. There are a couple of, one is just we're cautious, and the other reason for that, I think, is that it's really hard to identify the cascading effects that might happen and value them. At that point, if we lose the shallow seas, if we actually stay past 1.5 degrees, which we're going to surpass in the next couple of years, then it almost doesn't really matter what the price is. And so the accounting exercise becomes academic.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question if people are quick and succinct. The gentleman there in the grey jacket.
Thanks. Nick Alton, Centre for Macroeconomics. I will try to be quick. This is a conference on statistics and measurement, so I'd like to get back to the basics. It seems to me, and I'd like comments on the panel on this, that there's only really one firm statistic in this whole area, which is the global level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, primarily CO2. So the carbon footprint of the UK is essentially a modelled number, as I understand it. So we calculate the number of miles driven by cars, and we say that that emits a certain amount of carbon, per unit, per mile, and total it all up, and that gives us our annual emissions. But of course, it doesn't really matter very much what we're doing, because we're a small part of the total, even if it should be somewhat bigger on the consumption than the territorial basis. So what we need, of course, is an international system of measurement which is consistent, so that when everybody calculates their carbon imprint, using a similar method perhaps to ours, then the grand total should be what is coming out of the only reliable figures, nearly reliable, which is the concentration of global greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that will, of course, if it could be implemented, lead to better burden sharing if it still seems that we should be trying to rapidly reduce our greenhouse gases, as I guess 99.9% of people seem to think. So that's my, the main point. I'd just like the comments of the panel on that.
Okay, so thank you for that question. Let's kick off with Laura and then we'll come on.
Okay. I totally agree. Coordination across country and also coordination through the offices for national statistics will be extremely valuable. Extremely valuable. From what I understand, there is also this issue of standardization across measurement, and I think the Office for National Statistics are talking about how to standardize. Now, I want to go how that will actually drive the policy. I would say yes, it's good, but it's another matter because all countries are different. And for the case of the emerging economies, they consume lots of oil, still lots of fossil fuel, and something that now they call like clean coal. Okay, so they're reluctant to embrace this radical transition towards renewables. Although they are doing, it's in their pledge, they are very reluctant, exactly for what the comment that was coming before. So even if we have this coordination, this standardization of measurements and so on, each country is characterized by different economic structure and so on, so they will have different targets and therefore different policies as well. What I want to say is, yes, let's continue with the talk, but let's also realize that each country might want to achieve a sustainable development in a different way, according to perhaps what it's.
Thank you.
It happened. It's
so that's
useful
yes
for their
Laura.
citizens.
Okay, so the good news about calculating carbon footprints using consumption-based accounting with multi-regional input-output models is it takes that global figure as a starting point and reallocates it to all countries depending on their share of global spend on products. So we're not calculating bottom-up with each country doing a different thing and not reaching that total. We're using that total as the starting point and sharing it out. So in calculating the UK's carbon footprint, I am calculating the carbon footprint of every other country at the same time, so we can all do it using a constant methodology.
Thank you. Matthew?
I disagree with your premises, but agree with your conclusion. So I don't think that it's correct that something's only a statistic if it's observed scientifically in a lab somewhere. And I don't think that it's correct to say that, well, the UK is a small slice of global emissions, therefore it doesn't count. My co-panelists have answered the other questions. If we take the United States, I don't remember exactly, maybe it's 17% of global emissions or something. If we decide to break that down, not from one country, but to 50 individual states, each individual state is a tiny slice. of global emissions. Does this mean that no state in the United States should try to do anything about its emissions? No, that's patently absurd. And this story that, well, we're too small to make a difference is a pernicious narrative that is repeated over and over again. And I try to fight it wherever I can.
So on that cautionary note, let's not be pernicious, anyone. I'd like everyone to thank our panellists. And I've got two announcements to make, and guaranteed I'll mess one of them up. Firstly, the poster session is upstairs on the 8th floor. And secondly, for those coming tomorrow morning, do not use the entrance that we've been using for the last few days. We are now, how am I going to explain?
You're coming to the arcade.
There you go.
On
not the exchange.
Not the exchange. You're going to the arcade with the entrance from the Strand.
Thank you. And we'll see you upstairs. Thank you, everyone.